Hi, everyone. I am so glad that everyone was able to join us today for our webinar. It is the first of 3 webinars. The first topic today is going to be called Senior Care Financial Planning, and we will cover choices, costs, and strategies. For those of you who may not be familiar with who I am 𝗂𝗲𝗍𝗆. I'm a CFP and AEP over here at Tortuga Wealth Management. And we specialize in working with business owners and multi-gen families to make sure that wealth is being transferred from one generation to the next. And we're so glad that you can join us. So a couple housekeeping items. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can use that to submit any questions that you might have. And whatever you type out, we'll try to get to at the end of our webinar. And then we will show a few slides. We don't want this to be super slide heavy because we want this to have more of a conversational feel between Marcella and I. So all the slides will be available to you after the presentation. If you are registered, it'll just come to your email automatically. And yeah, that's about it for housekeeping. So today I'm so excited to introduce Marcella Miller. She is joining us from Salus Homecare, and she's a senior care specialist and aging advisor. And she's just going to tell us a little bit about what she does and how she got involved in this industry.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I started my journey into senior care about 17, almost 18 years ago. When I graduated college, I had a degree in music therapy, and that really was a segue for me into working with older adults, and specifically older adults with memory impairments and stroke survivors. And so I saw and worked with a lot of older adults with dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and like I said, strokes. And that was a really beautiful time for me of kind of opening up my world to this whole aging and senior care and getting to work with them on this music therapy side. And then after about 8 years of doing that, I really realized that I loved working with seniors so much, and music being such a niche kind of topic and way to work with seniors, I decided I really wanted to open up my practice and skill set and really help people who are navigating aging, because so many families are in crisis mode when that starts happening. And that's really what transitioned me to working at Salus Homecare. And so I've been working, I have experience in not just my music therapy, like I said, but working in assisted livings and memory cares, also skilled nursing facilities, and now doing in-home care in hospice. And so we at Salus provide a spectrum of care. And so we can start working with someone at the very beginning of their aging journey, all the way up to end of life, and supporting them along the way there. And so now my passion and my joy is getting to meet families where they're at and help them navigate, where their loved one is and what are next steps and options for them, and all of that. So yeah. Angela, do you want to go through the topics that we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, for sure. So today we have a few different topics that we will go through. We'll go through the aging landscape, and we'll just kind of touch upon the different statistics and demographics, the current trends in senior care, and how it could impact generationally, because it's not just you or your aging parents. What are the types of options and costs that are available as we age, and what are some of the financial strategies that can be taken that we currently see happening today, and some final takeaways. And like I said, we'll save some room at the end for some Q&A. So that being said, we'll just dive right into kind of like the aging landscape. I know there's a lot going on this page, so you don't need to we're not going to read all of it because like I said, we're going to provide the slides for you. But, one of the things that, I wanted to touch upon is just how much longer we're all living I'm sure everyone's heard about the silver tsunami. And basically, just as the name implies, it's just a tsunami, a tidal wave of people aging. Because by 2030, they are saying that 1 in every 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. And, unfortunately, most people are not ready for what that entails when it comes to aging. In fact, something like, I don't know if I'm mistaken, Marcel, you can kind of fill me in on this, but I think like 80% of the people out there are just not ready to age correctly, or maybe not correctly isn't the right word, but they're just not ready to age, whether it is aging in their home, or whether it is, being in an assisted living or some sort of senior care community. People just are not ready for that next step. And I think part of the reason is denial too, in some cases, not every case, but.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of preparation that has, as a culture, we haven't done a good job of really doing, of sitting down, having these conversations and really talking about what our desires are for ourselves as we age. And if anybody has been in the estate planning world or adjacent to it at all, you know how difficult it is. I'm sure with wealth advising too, it is so difficult to get people to come together and talk about the future, especially when the future is very uncertain and it involves unsavory topics like not being able to care for oneself or, death. And so there's a lot of scary, fear around talking about these things, but that's, I think, the purpose of why we are doing this webinar is to really help bring awareness around what are the topics to talk about, specifically, so you can start getting a plan in place for yourself and your family.
So now with, being in this industry, what are some of like the trends that you're seeing these days?
Yeah.
Are people choosing to, be home? Are more people choosing to join these, progressive communities? And maybe you can touch upon what exactly that means. Are people just more of like an emergency situation? Maybe mom or dad has a fall and they end up in the hospital and the hospital says, we can't just release you back to your home because your home's not safe anymore. Like what do you see happening these days?
Yeah, we already touched on, people are living longer. And so with that, I am seeing people living longer with a lot more comorbidities, right, is what we call it. Multiple things going on, not just diabetes anymore, but maybe some dementia, maybe some heart failure, some renal failure. There's a lot of things going on. So people are living longer, but they also are maybe a little more sicker than we have seen in the past, right? And living with that higher level of care medically. I'm also seeing a lot of changes, like just in insurance and the landscape there, right? A lot of people, Medicare used to be like the primary insurance, and now we have a lot of managed care, and that does play a really important factor into what services people can get. And then there's this really unique space that's opening up right now that we're seeing that's really not regulated very well by Medicare just yet. But, we've all heard of different levels of care. There's, you get out of the hospital and you have home health. Insurance pays for that. You get a physical therapist to help you rehab at home, and maybe a nurse and some other services. And then if you are really sick and you're towards the end of life, then maybe hospice is prescribed, right? And Medicare pays for that as well. And that is a great service to help people transition in their end of life stage. But there's this middle ground that's kind of new and upcoming called palliative care. And palliative has always been synonymous with hospice in the past. But now palliative care, they're making it its own standalone service, and it does not mean hospice. Palliative is really now, it's a focus on comfort care, but just like hospice is focused on comfort, but it is for a person who is not yet ready for hospice, but they are living with a very advanced illness. This illness is most likely chronic and will not get better, but they could live with it for several years. And so we think of like kidney disease. That's a very progressive disease, and your functioning goes down by percentages. And so a person like with kidney disease might be on palliative care for a year or two before they're appropriate or ready for hospice. And really the idea with palliative is insurance is paying for it, so that's great. And you get a little more medical care coming to your home, so a nurse practitioner, but you get to keep everybody else the same, like your specialists, your primary care doctors. And so anyway, I'm seeing a lot more of that up and coming, and I do think it's a really useful tool because it's keeping people out of the hospital and helping them thrive in their home longer because of that.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
I mean, it's crazy because, we have this one client, speaking of all the different types of care that's out there, and I think we all, maybe not all of us, but we definitely have some clients who just want to be home, no matter what. In fact, we actually have a client who we'll just call them Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They were in their 80s, and they actually moved into one of these progressive senior communities where they were in independent living. So, and it was really close to their home. So the husband, Mr. Smith, would go back home every couple of days just to check on the house, check on things. And unfortunately, during one of those trips, he ended up falling and breaking his hip, and then he rapidly declined. And so then because of that decline, it kind of made Mrs. Smith also rapidly decline. And so she ended up going on to the assisted living side. So maybe you can also talk about how when there's a couple and one person isn't doing great, how does that affect the other spouse?
Yeah, I mean, spouses are they end up being the primary caregivers. I think the statistic, something like in the 80s, 80 percentile of caregivers are the spouse. And so that has been, that's very taxing on people. And as your story tells, one person declines significantly and it affects the other. We work with a lot of clients who both have care needs, and their care needs are almost always extremely different. One is usually very able-bodied, but maybe their memory is poor, and the complete opposite for the other person is really what I see a lot of. But that's tricky. So in a lot of cases, maybe a spouse is very able-bodied, very cognitively able, and so they are become the primary caregiver for the spouse who's declining and not, aging very well. But then that takes a toll on them, and there are a lot of studies out there that show, primary caregivers becoming very ill and even dying before the person who's actually aging, worse off, who's had like this longer term needing care. And it's just because of the stress and the taxing on that person. So whenever I meet with families, and maybe it's the wife who's the primary caregiver, and she's holding it all together, and she's done that for many years, kind of the matriarch of the family, right? And that's a lot of our conversations is, what does your future look like? How can we come in and give you some reprieve? We don't have to come in and take over everything, but we can give you a break so that you can go to lunch with your friends. You can go play golf or do those things that fill up your bucket so that you can be a fully present caregiver to your husband, on the days that you're on. And so we really see how that helps kind of tip the scales and allows that spouse to thrive.
Right. Well, what happens in situations where, like in your example, if that wife was the primary caregiver and, you know, she ends up dying because of all the stress and, you know, of taking care of her ailing husband. So then what if she dies? Then who steps in and what happens next?
Very good question. And I'm seeing, another trend is just our culture as a whole. We are not a culture where children really step in and care for their parents. And there's a lot of reasons to that, but we have become, we're a wealthy country, so we can afford to have people come in and do that for us. But that's not our culture. To kids, and we're going to get to this, but kids have families, they have careers, they don't live locally. So it becomes a big challenge of who is going to be that person to step in and care. And so that's often the calls I get are from the adult children who are like very panicked, very crisis mode. Yeah. So let's hopefully we can avoid some of that with this discussion today.
Right. Because when you're in crisis mode, I don't think people make the best decisions, right?
Yeah, almost every single person I'm talking to, they are in crisis mode. They need a whole lot of information, but they have like a day or two to make a decision because the hospital's like, your loved one's leaving tomorrow, and we're just now letting you know. Like we're giving you 24, at best 48-hour notice. And that's very common. I believe the law is a 48-hour notice. But that is not enough time to go shopping to find a caregiver or shopping to find an assisted living unless you've been doing that work kind of beforehand and you have resources to, pull upon quickly.
And now as a family, how would you even know where do you even begin to determine what might be the best situation for your mom or for your dad or for yourself for that matter if you are pre-planning? But it sounds like most people are not pre-planning. So it sounds like a lot of people are in crisis mode, unfortunately. So in that sort of a situation, how do you determine what is the best course of action for your aging parent?
Yeah. Like I said, it's a lot of information that you need to get to you in like a bite size that you can take and run with it. The hospital will give their list of resources and maybe even a recommendation of like, hey, your loved one needs to go to a rehab facility for a couple weeks. And then that can buy you some time to figure out your next steps before they come home. But the hospital studies are showing that rehab facilities are maybe not the best environment for getting better. And so they are actually sending patients home, where 10 years ago, you would be in skilled nursing facility for a full knee replacement. Now it's an outpatient surgery in most cases. They send you home and you're walking on it like the next day or that day. So we've come a long way.
Right.
But insurance is also squeezing and saying, nope, let's get these patients home. But they're actually having better outcomes. And so that requires a lot of support to go home after a hip fracture or knee replacement to be able to get around. It requires a lot of support.
Right. Well, speaking of requiring a lot of support, I think the average duration of long-term care is, as this slide shows, about 3.7 years for women and 2.2 years for men, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Um,
I really want people to take in that this is on average, right? And maybe it's a good
right.
tool to use for planning purposes. But your unique situation with your loved one is going to play a big role in that, right? Like if your parent has dementia, a person can live with that for 10 to 20 years, depending on, the rest of their health picture. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure with memory care, there's so much more complications with that as well. It sounds like, from what I understand, there's different facilities that you might want to consider for memory care who might specialize in that. So with all these things, let's talk about how much it all costs. So let me share this slide with everybody. And it looks like, hopefully everyone can see that. So obviously, as we all know, healthcare costs in general have skyrocketed along with everything else. And in fact, I was actually reading recently about how during retirement, your healthcare costs are approximately $172,000 for the duration of your retirement. So say, for instance, you're 65 and your age of mortality is 85, we'll say. So that's 20 years. So that's an additional $8,600 a year in just healthcare costs, which do not include long-term care. So that's a 4% increase over last year's number, just to give people an idea of how much things cost. And unfortunately, most Americans underestimate how much healthcare is going to cost in retirement and how much long-term care will cost in retirement, unfortunately. I was actually talking to somebody else yesterday, and she was just talking about how, the landscape has changed from even 20 years, 10 years ago even, where there was a lot more people who came in with long-term care insurance, and now it's very, very limited in terms of people who do have that and just having a hard time finding ways to pay for care. So maybe you can talk about how much all of this costs.
Yeah, so it's gotten very expensive, and I hate to say it, but I think it will continue to be more expensive in the future. Just for some comparison, Salus opened their doors in 2004. And so just to give you like a 20-year difference here, back in 2005, our services were $16 an hour for a caregiver. And today they start at $38 an hour. And so that's, a big increase. And we are very middle of the road price wise, very comparable with our competitors. And so we're not the cheapest, but we're definitely not the most expensive. And so, and you definitely get what you pay for in this industry, but I thought it was kind of cool to compare neighboring states, because we have, I know I have a mindset that Nevada, Arizona, Utah are so much cheaper than California. And I was personally shocked to see that it's like not that big of a difference. Yes, it's a difference and it's cheaper, but it's not a huge difference. So, but yeah, cost is for sure a thing. I think families are going to have to get more creative and probably help pitch in a lot more. But the number one question I get when people call is, does Medicare or does my medical insurance cover a caregiver? And if you go to Medicare's website, right there at the very beginning, it says they do not cover long-term care. And so what is long-term care? Well, long-term care is helping a person with their day-to-day activities of daily living. And that's a little phrase that you're going to hear everywhere as you are navigating this aging landscape. Activities of daily living include bathing, dressing, using the restroom, making meals, light housekeeping. That is all kind of custodial care is another way to think of it. Things that you do day in and day out. Medicare does not pay for that. And so that's very shocking to a lot of people. And where they can get services through the state and government is Medi-Cal. And Medi-Cal is a needs-based. They have opened that up to be more inclusive and continuing to do so. And so for people who really need, those services, there is some help through that. It's not robust. It's very, very minimal. And I think it's going to be harder to get as far as maybe they grant you access, but in terms of getting the service that you need, it's going to be harder because there's just not a lot of funding for that, right? And so I think people need to be very realistic when they're thinking ahead to their future of how they're going to pay for care. Maybe you can get a little care over here with Medi-Cal. Maybe you can have a little nest egg. Hopefully you do, because that's going to really be where you pay for care. And then hopefully you have some family that can step in and help out too. Those are kind of the
Thank goodness
ideal.
for family. Just have lots of children.
Lots of kids.
Who
Be
make
really
really
nice to
good
them.
money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. What percentage would you say of the people that you work with the population that you work with, where you see children, adult children, helping take care of mom or dad?
At least 50%. It's a high percentage. Yeah. We have clients that we definitely do 24-hour around the clock care for, but their kids are still very involved. We have some that don't have any family, they have like a conservator or something like that that's helping to manage things. But for the majority of the people hiring caregiving services, we are not full-time by any means. We are coming in a few days a week, maybe a few hours a week, and just supplementing to give the family a break. And I think that is going to be more and more the future because of the expense.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure it's just so overbearing for some families who are not well prepared to take on that financial responsibility. So that being said, let me share another screen with everybody. And so speaking of costs and managing these long-term care costs, there's several different strategies that are available. And Marcella kind of talked about Medi-Cal here in California, which is basically Medicaid nationally, but here in California, it's called Medi-Cal. And like Marcella said, it is need-based. But as we all know, with just how tight everything is, there's just not as much money out there, and you're not necessarily being able to choose whatever facility you want because, there are Medi-Cal friendly facilities, or just a lot more red tape that you would have to go through in order to qualify for Medi-Cal. But it is an option for those who really don't have the assets or income stream. Although Medi-Cal just did away with the asset levels earlier this year, if I recall correctly. Yeah. And they still have the income limits though. So if you have a CalSTRS pension or something like that, where you're making $120,000 a year, just from your pension alone, you probably won't be qualifying for Medi-Cal anyway. Other than that, there's, there are the traditional long-term care policies, which really don't exist anymore, but some people might still have them that they're paying into. And then you have the hybrid life insurance or annuity policies out there. Once again, you would have to qualify for that by going through a health assessment to make sure that you are, the life insurance company needs to make sure that they qualify you to be insured. And so a lot of these policies are great because, for example, we have this client, and this is very typical of so many different clients of ours, where maybe the couple, they bought an insurance policy for their kids 30 years ago. Now the kids are grown. They don't really need the life insurance portion of it anymore, but they've built up all this cash value inside of it. So when a situation like that arises, you can actually move that into a different policy that has long-term care riders on it. So a lot of these life insurance and annuity policies will have riders on it that will pay. So if you use it for long-term care, you get to use it for that. But if you were to die prematurely, then it still pays a life insurance benefit to your beneficiaries. So it's not like you don't use it, you lose it. You actually get to keep the best of, whichever one it is that you need for your family's needs at that time. And then, I know some people might see reverse mortgages as just like a really odd thing to think about, but that is another way to tap into some funds. And because it's a loan against your house, that money is non-taxable because it's not an income, it's a loan that you're putting against your house. It doesn't mean that you lose your house. It just means that you get to get a loan, and that's why they call it a reverse mortgage, because a lot of people have all this equity in their home, especially if they bought their home many, many years ago. So that's another way that you can tap into. And then, maybe you have some real estate investments, or maybe you have just, whatever sort of investments that you have, and you have an income stream coming from that, that can help pay for these expenses too. But, it seems to me from talking to many different people that unfortunately a lot of people are on crisis mode. When mom or dad falls or breaks a hip or something like that, that's when people kind of kick it into gear of like, oh, we really need to think about this. We really need to allocate funds, instead of thinking about the future and saying, okay, chances are, especially if you're 65 already, I think statistically they say that if you and your spouse are 65 years of age or older, chances of one of you needing long-term care services during your lifetime is something like 70 or 80%. So it's important to start planning ahead of time. And if you have children, it's less of a burden for your children. And if you don't have children, it allows you to make those decisions about who you want to hire as your conservator in case you are in a position where you need that. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that's kind of like the main takeaway.
Yeah, no, I think those are good to always list how people can tap into services and pay for services, right? One other one that I'm going to add is if your parent served in the United States military, there could be veteran funds available. And so an agency like ours, we are contracted with the VA. And so that is something that's great because it's free home care when people qualify for that. And so that's definitely something. And that's often when I'm on a call with a family and they're looking into options, I'm going through this list with them of like how they can pay for services and what we can help them tap into. And one other thing I'm going to say about that $38 an hour, I do want to make sure that people understand that's going with an agency that is licensed, bonded, and insured. So we have workers' compensation. Every caregiver is an employee of our company. And so you could go on the open market and hire your neighbor or a friend of a friend, and the cost is going to be less than going through an agency. But you are then essentially the employer according to California law. And so you just want to go into that with eyes wide open of knowing you need insurance, you need to understand the wages and how to pay caregivers correctly, to avoid a lawsuit, especially, and, there's attorneys that prey upon private caregivers to educate them on what they're due and owed, and very lovely families who have had to learn the hard way. So telling you, like, you can make that decision for your family, what's best. Like my grandma said, you can't get blood out of a turnip. So if you don't have anything, you might be okay hiring a friend of a friend and paying a lot less per hour, but just knowing, all the options available out there.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, California law does make it a little tricky as an employer. It's a very employee-friendly state that we live in. So I've heard so many horror stories about having somebody that you just hire things not going the way you plan it to be, because
Yeah.
you're trying to save a buck by doing that, and then you end up embroiled in some sort of a lawsuit, like a wage lawsuit.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want families to know what they're kind of entering into so they can do their due diligence and set it up. There are ways to, I'm sure, set it up in your home and do that privately, but you'll just have to be diligent about that. And we haven't talked too much, Angela, but maybe we should touch on like assisted living too.
Yes.
Because I'm obviously home care is my wheelhouse where, that's my business, but assisted living is a huge piece of this aging solution for people. And there's different levels, right? Like there's memory care, there's independent living, assisted, and what I see is most times people are making that choice to move into assisted living once the caregiving has gotten to become full-time or more. So if it's like over 45 hours a week, that's where you see the costs start making sense, that if they need, especially around the clock care, it's going to be, at least half of what you're paying for in-home care. And so it's a real financial solution for a lot of families too, where they can get good care, but save quite a bit of money as well if they need that.
Right. And there's a lot of different assisted living facilities that go from being independent to having the assisted living portion of that community right there. And then even a little bit of into memory care as well, from what I understand with some of these progressive assisted living facilities. But yeah, it seems like we definitely have a lot of great options, even just here locally in the South Bay, but all over LA and Orange County, really, there's a lot of great options that are available to us, which is great. They're everything from home health care to assisted living to memory care on the far end.
Yeah.
Everything in between.
There is, there's these beautiful like residential homes called boarding cares that have been turned into like a little mini assisted living that have maybe 6 residents that live there. And I love them for certain patients, certain clients that we work with that I think it's a great solution for them. And so you have to shop and understand what your parent needs and find the right community for those needs. But there's also a really big price difference. So like a boarding care in the South Bay might be 7,000-8,000, where assisted living is going to be like 10 or 12. And then you add memory care, like it could be up to 15,000 a month. So it just really depends. And then of course, if you go outside of the LA area, it's going to be even less expensive. So there's more flexibility, I think, with that.
Yeah, and then there's also adult daycare services that are available at some of these facilities, where maybe, you are staying with mom or dad at night, so that if something happens in the middle of the night, you're there and you're not hiring somebody to be there at night. But maybe during the day, you can drop off mom at an adult daycare facility where, she is still able to get all the stimulation that she needs and interaction that she needs, and she's in capable hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The one question I'm going to answer is the $38 an hour is kind of an average hourly rate. And so for 24-hour care, and with California labor laws and how it's calculated, which I'm not going to get into all of that, 24-hour care is going to be between 25,000 to 30,000 a month for around the clock care in the LA area, just to kind of answer that for folks. And so again, those costs, you can have in-home care for a few hours a week, and that's going to cost a few $100s, all the way up to, 30,000 on the high end, just to kind of give you, it's a very large spectrum. And that's what I love about home care is we can come in and meet people where they're at and just do a little bit or a lot, whatever they need.
Yeah. Well, why don't we wrap up so that we have time to get to some of our questions. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to give everybody a few final takeaways. Just trying to avoid crisis mode so that you can plan now for future peace of mind. And then planning early just gives you more choices so that you're not at the hospital with 48 hours notice trying to figure out where mom or dad needs to go. And you're probably going to end up paying a lot more doing something like that at the last minute as well. And then, by planning early, say for instance, if your home is remodeled for you to be more independent, maybe you can remodel in such a way so that it prevents falls inside your own home. And so that could be something else that you do so that you don't end up in the hospital and then you end up in some sort of a long-term care facility. By planning ahead, you can kind of maybe even prevent some of that. And, just preparing for these long-term needs, some of the longer-term needs like dementia and Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, these definitely are much longer term situations. So just keeping that in mind. So anyway, just wanted to have that as some final takeaways. And here at Tortuga, we partner with a lot of wonderful people in our community who are able to, help our clients with everything from legal matters to helping them determine what is the best home health care plan for them, what might be the best, CPA for them, whatever it is, we like to take a team approach in helping our clients. So with that, let's get to our Q&As because we have quite a few questions and we want to be mindful of time. So one of the questions here is, can you provide more detail on the unexpected costs for in-home care that people often overlook?
So the cost that I'm talking about is for the caregiver. And so when you're having care come into the home is continuing to run and operate kind of like how it has, right? So you still have, a gardener if you're paying for that, whatever services and utilities and food for the person living there. All of that stays the same. And so really, it's pretty straightforward as far as the costs go. If you need somebody to drive you to doctor's appointments and they're driving their own vehicle, then there's going to be a charge for mileage. And so that's a cost there. But as far as like supplies and food go, that's something you're going to be providing regardless of having care in the home or not, if that person is needing those things. And so what we do is really work closely with the family or the designated representative to kind of identify what those costs are as far as like food, supplies, all of that up front so that we can get a game plan going and who's going to be ordering those things or keeping track of them and so on and so forth.
Okay. And then speaking of costs, how do they differ for a certified nursing assistant versus a companion? And kind of along these lines, what is the education and experience of the staff providing the home care and other services to the client? Does it differ based on the type of service? And does the hourly cost differ based on the staff's level of experience?
These are great questions. So a certified nursing assistant is a certification that caregivers get to work at a skilled nursing facility. And so they are required to have a CNA license to work there. When you're working for, and let me be clear, a skilled nursing facility is a skilled, and the name tells you what level of care it is. And so it's nurses assistants. It is a skilled, meaning that these people who are staying there and rehabbing there have come out of the hospital kind of a step down as far as needs go medically. So they have medical needs. They have maybe a wound or something that they are needing a lot of attention to. People can have those things and be living in home, but the requirements are not the same. So we do not, in-home care is not required to have a CNA to provide that care in the home. And I'll talk, just yesterday I had a family and we were talking about that. And when I asked, like, what is it about a CNA that you think your loved one needs? They're going, well, I think it's more just our experience with a CNA has been better, right? They seem to have more experience and XYZ. And I said, okay, I totally agree with that, and understand that. And I think what was at the heart of their discussion and issue was they thought they needed a CNA because they thought that was the level of experience that their parent needs, and that all caregivers would have that level of experience if they had a CNA. And what I want to share with everyone is caregivers can have that level of experience without having a CNA certification, simply because they've been a 20-year, career caregiver, and they have seen and done it all. And so I think my experience of working with families for a long period of time has been families need the right fit for their loved one. And that is my job, is to help find that right fit. Maybe they have a CNA license, maybe they don't, but as far as experience goes, personality goes, all of that, it's very nuanced, and that's the most important thing. I think there was a second part to that question that I'm not remembering, as far as companion care versus, and like cost differentiate. I think it was cost differences.
Yeah, cost difference between for a certified CNA versus a companion.
Yes. Yeah. So you'll typically see a CNA maybe cost a couple dollars more an hour if that is something that you're like, I absolutely have to have. Because a lot of those CNAs are working at these communities or skilled nursing facilities, I should say. And so they're not necessarily working for an in-home care agency. When we look at what we're going to charge a client, companion care, all of that, as long as their needs are pretty within like a pretty basic realm, our dollar per hour doesn't change. However, if they are like bedbound, really extensive care, they have it's 100% full on care, then it might be a little more expensive because of that. And we're looking for somebody who has that level of experience. And the experience is really hands-on. We're hiring people who have hands-on experience as a caregiver. We bring them in, we vet them, we make sure they have that hands-on experience. And then we're also like testing them out with another caregiver in the field to make sure that they are up to snuff with a caregiver that we really trust. And so that's how we kind of like vet them too before we go send them on their own assignment. And sink or swim. We don't want to do that. And so we like pair them up with another caregiver just to make sure that our vetting has been accurate. That's a lot of information.
All really good information. I hope everyone's taking notes. So here's another question. Do VA benefits only apply to the service member, or are there any benefits available to their widow, children, etc.?
It depends on the program. There are programs that will provide care for a spouse that was married to a veteran. I do not believe it would extend to children, but I have seen programs that extends to the spouse, the living, surviving spouse, and sometimes even if they were divorced, it sometimes has happened too that they've gotten care. But I've seen that mostly through a third party that taps into VA benefits. And those are going to be really minimal, like 12 hours a week of care. So not a lot. And then, but if you are going into the VA healthcare system directly, which is what we have a contract with, then those services can be quite robust and and provide a lot depending on, I believe, their service level and their need and all of that.
Okay. And we have a couple more. So what specific steps can an adult child take to start talking to their aging parent about senior care and without causing stress? Like, what are some strategies? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people where, you know, their parents don't really want to talk about this with their children.
Yeah. You know, I've been doing this with my own folks. They live back in Oklahoma. And so when I'm visiting, I've just made a point to kind of talk with them about friends and the people we grew up with and their parents and kind of how they're aging and then just kind of get the dialogue going. And then I turn it on to my parents of like, if that were to happen to you, you know, we have a friend, a family friend who the wife had a brain aneurysm and needed some care. And so if that happened to you, like, what would you want us to do for you? Like, what would your wishes be? And really making it about honoring their desires as they age. And so, you know, we got into a big discussion actually about cancer and, you know, if it was a certain type of cancer or certain level, like honoring quality of life over treatment. And it really was eye-opening to me because it was not at all what I thought my parent would say. And so this has been over a course of several years now that we've been having these discussions. And then one year I come home and they finally had gotten their estate plan done. And then they talked to me about which one of us kids they chose to be. They're like, we would like you because you have all the experience, but you're, you know, across the country. So we picked the sibling who's close by. And I said, yes, I think that is the smart thing to do. And I can help in these ways, but it should be somebody local. And so I think just kind of starting to have those discussions in a non-threatening way of like, oh, hey, did you hear about so-and-so? What are your wishes? Or I'm really concerned because I've also seen this work where you say, I'm really concerned because I see like you had a fall or you've had multiple falls or you use something from their history. And it really scared me. And it made me realize that if you weren't able to speak for yourself, I don't know what you would want me to say for you. So can we have that discussion? Because I want to honor you, but I also am losing sleep at night, like with worry. And so hopefully that can help kind of open up that conversation too.
Right. Yeah, it's a touchy subject for sure. I mean, I know with what we do, we'll notice some of our clients start to um, not be as sharp, for example. And that's one of the reasons why we require a trusted contact. And it's not just for a senior, it's for everybody across the board. Whoever has accounts with us have to have a trusted contact. So that's the person that we would call if we have a concern about that client. So for instance, you know, we have this client where, you know, he was a senior and super sharp all the way through his 80s. And then we started noticing as he got into his 90s that he was starting to slow down and he would forget things or he would say things over and over again. And, you know, we started to question it. And so we had to call his children and say, hey, what's going on with dad? You know, he's not as sharp and we're noticing these situations. And they're like, yeah, we've noticed it too. We've noticed it in the past year. So with those conversations, we were able to actually, this particular senior client was very open to us having a very open conversation. So we would do a family meeting with the kids, dad, and say, hey, you know, maybe it's a good idea to have so-and-so be co-trustee now, or, you know, and bring about it from a different angle of more of let's protect the assets more instead of you need help. We bring it from the angle of like, you know, just in case something were to happen to you, we don't want anybody else to get access to your assets or whatever. And so we just kind of go about it by bringing the adult children into the conversation of how to care for the aging parent. So
That sounds smart.
I guess this kind of ties in. Another question was, what sorts of forms or documents would be necessary for the family to have to help care for their aging parents? And I think one of them would be, making sure that you have a healthcare directive. I think that's so important. I think most people who have a trust will have that as part of their trust, but we even met with somebody literally yesterday where the person that was going to be in charge of his healthcare directive, if he were to pass or become incapacitated, he hadn't updated it. It was a deceased family member. And so it's important to make sure that your aging parents have these documents like healthcare directives. Your POA, power of attorney, is all up to date. And that's why we always recommend that you meet with your attorney on a regular basis to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row, that you're prepared for that. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, there is, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but there's one called Prepare. There's a couple organizations out there that help people kind of approach that conversation about their healthcare directive and how to navigate those conversations, but also giving the people who are filling it out kind of like a little worksheet and template, so it's not so scary, or just really helpful of like getting you to think through those questions. And so there are several templates out there that I would just say to like Google and find those. The one that I love is like not coming to my mind, but I know that I Googled there's Prepare. I've heard of that one. And anyway, there's another one out there that I can't think of right now. If I think of it, I will let you know.
It'll pop into your brain as soon as this is over. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left. I think we have time for one more question. So one of the questions says, you say to be prepared, but besides long-term care insurance, who should a retiree contact to prepare regarding health preparations and agencies and things like that? Any thoughts on that, Marcella?
Well, I think this, my answer is going to tie into one of the questions we're not going to get to either, but I think at a point where your parents, you can tell they're definitely starting to age, you start talking to healthcare people, start going to the local assisted living just to get a flavor. I think obviously we're here with a wealth advising company. I really think that they are key people to bring into the conversation to help with projections and just options. And then they're going to know people like me who can be an advisor based off of your parents' specific needs, because that's really how the conversation is going to be shaped and who else needs to be brought into that.
Yeah.
Primary care physician is going to be a good person as well.
For sure. Yeah, I was going to say something very similar to that. I think if you have an aging parent, having a relationship with your parents' financial advisor, attorney, CPA, healthcare providers, all of the above is so important to be connected to all those people because, if you have multiple siblings, who's going to be the executor of the trust? Who's going to have the power of attorney on mom or dad? Having all those conversations, having family meetings on a regular basis so that there's no friction when that time comes, I think is very important, because I think too often people are not on the same page and it's, you end up blowing up the situation. So we are out of time, unfortunately. I will say that if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. And like I said, since you have registered for this webinar, you'll be getting a follow-up email with all of our contact information along with the webinar presentation. So thank you for joining us. And it seems like it was a very popular subject. So we'll try to do another one of these at some point in the next few months or so, maybe 6 months or so, something like that.
And we are, I mean, I know I definitely am, and I know Angela is, we're definitely available via email if you want to reach out with specific questions or for your situation. Happy to keep answering some of these questions that you might have had that we didn't get to.
All right. Thanks, Marcella, for joining us. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a happy summer.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.